In the previous section, we defined the problem that arises when you apply the principle of one literal sense to the interpretation of Messianic prophecy. You're forced into a situation where you must either agree with Hengstenberg that the prophet didn't know what he was talking about, or you must agree with historical criticism that the New Testament authors were simply relecturing or inventing a connection between an Old Testament text and the person and work of Jesus. In this session, we'll see if we can identify a solution to that problem and apply it to a test case and see how it helps us to interpret a difficult text. So this is what happens if you adopt the principle of one literal sense and connect that with the notion of rectilinear prophecy. You're going to be faced with a situation where you're going to have to say either the prophet was a false prophet and was wrong, or else the evangelist or New Testament writer was simply making up a connection that didn't actually exist. As critical scholars would say, he was relecturing the text. So perhaps, given that stark alternative, we might want to consider the application of this principle of one literal sense and ask whether there's a third way to approach this or not. We mentioned typological prophecy. We mentioned rectilinear prophecy. The question is there some third kind of prophecy? And of course, since I put the question that way, it should be obvious that I think the answer is yes, there is. And I'm going to call this typolinear prophecy. Now, the term typolinear prophecy is not one that's in wide use. So far as I know, I'm the only one who's ever used it. And you might object that I made up the word, but the truth is somebody makes up every word. Every word is used for the first time by somebody. So what am I trying to communicate by calling this typolinear prophecy? Well, what I'm suggesting is that this is a kind of prophecy that has some aspects that are related to typology and other aspects that are related to rectilinear prophecy. So what would it look like? Well, first, what I call typolinear prophecy is verbal. It's like rectilinear prophecy in that it consists of words, not of persons, places, things, or events like typology. But it has an escalating fulfillment or fulfillment over time in stages like typology does. This means that it's possible that a typolinear prophecy could speak to the situation of the prophet and at the same time anticipate a greater fulfillment in the future. And this, I think, is how we answer the problem of one literal sense. So the question is, how can we reconcile typolinear prophecy with the principle of one literal sense? Or to put it another way, in what sense is this literal if it has more than one fulfillment or fulfillment in more than one stage? Well, here we have to understand the history of this process. You see, the principle of one literal sense was crafted in the context of medieval interpretation as a response to the medieval fourfold method of interpretation. Now, the fourfold method was not universally adopted, but it was fairly common. And the fourfold method argued that for text there was up to as many as 4 different meanings. One meaning was literal. That was the historical meaning, the meaning in its original historical context. The second level or type of meaning was allegorical. That is, it taught a spiritual or theological truth. The third was moral, sometimes called tropological. That is to say, it taught a moral lesson. The third meaning was the moral lesson. And the fourth meaning was the eschatological or anagogical meaning. Now, this deals with the way the text points to the eschaton. So, the question is, with respect to the literal historical sense, we have to remember the history of interpretation at this point. This argument was really about the way narrative texts were interpreted, particularly texts like the creation account, where the creation account was allegorized so that everything had a symbolic meaning. And also allegory was widely applied to names and to numbers in order to find some spiritual meaning behind the names and the numbers. And it was also applied particularly in cases where God did something that violated the cultural sensibilities of the ancient world, the ancient Greek world in particular, and so it was thought necessary to kind of explain those away. But the point is this: the things that the principle of one literal sense was crafted to respond to were the kind of spiritual, multiple level applications that were applied to the creation account. The principle of one literal sense was never intended to answer the question of how prophecy is fulfilled. And that's a very important point, because I would argue that the application of the principle of unus sensus literalis, one literal sense, to the interpretation of prophecy is a misappropriation or misapplication of the principle. It wasn't intended to do that. It wasn't crafted as an explanation for how prophecy works. It was crafted as a response of the tendency of medieval interpreters to allegorize narrative text and names and numbers. So, we come back to the question, how can we reconcile typolinear prophecy with the principle of one literal sense? And the answer, I think, is straightforward. That is that the notion of fulfillment in stages is the one literal sense of typolinear prophecy. But you ask, how can that be? Because how can something that's fulfilled in stages be one sense? The answer to that is that the one literal sense is not a static sense. It's not a fixed thing. Rather, the process of development is the literal thing in this text. It is the process of fulfilling in stages that is what is intended, and therefore that is the literal meaning. So, I want to reiterate that the assertion that there are typolinear prophecies is not an attempt to deny that there are rectilinear prophecies. And I say that because it is sometimes presented that way, as if arguing for fulfillment in stages is a way of denying that Christ is the fulfillment of these prophecies. And that is not the case at all. I'm not suggesting that God can't predict the future. I'm not suggesting that the prophets did not anticipate the coming of Christ. What we're attempting to do is to conform our understanding of prophecy to the actual practice of the biblical authors and the way that they crafted and articulated what God had revealed to them. Let's look now at a test case and see how we might apply this to the interpretation of the prophecy in Isaiah chapter 7, verses 10 to 17. So there, in Isaiah we read, first, the Lord spoke to Ahaz and said, "Ask a sign of the Lord your God, let it be as deep as Sheol or as high as the heaven." But Ahaz says, "I will not ask, I will not put the Lord to the test." And he said, "Hear then, O house of David, is it too little for you to weary men, that you weary God also?" Then continues, "Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, the virgin," here the Hebrew word is Alma, we'll come back to that in a minute, the Alma, or virgin, will conceive and bear a son, and she will call his name Emmanuel. He will eat curds and honey when he knows how to refuse the evil and choose the good. For before the boy knows how to refuse evil and choose good, the land whose two kings you dread will be deserted. The Lord will bring upon you and upon your people and upon your father's house such days as have not come since the days Ephraim departed from Judah, namely the king of Assyria. So, what is this prophecy about? Well, if we read it within the context of the book of Ahaz, a couple of things are clear. First, this is a sign to Ahaz. God gives this as a sign to Ahaz. And so for it to function as a sign for Ahaz, it must have some meaning that Ahaz could comprehend and evaluate. The point of the sign is that within a certain time frame associated with the birth and maturation of a child, the king of Damascus, whose name was Rezin, and the king of Ephraim, whose name was Pekah, would be defeated by the king of Assyria. The king of Assyria is going to come and eliminate these two kings that threaten Judah. And, as we said, this will happen before a soon-to-be-born child will reach the age of what we might describe as moral discernment. So, how is this fulfilled? Well, the king of Assyria did come and defeat the kings of Damascus and Samaria, and this was completed in 732 BC. So if Isaiah is a true prophet, then this sign to Ahaz must have been fulfilled not later than 732 BC. Otherwise, Isaiah is a false prophet. We turn now to the Gospel of Matthew, where we read in chapter 1, Joseph, son of David, do not fear to take Mary as your wife, for that which she is conceived in her is from the Holy Spirit. She will bear a son. You will call his name Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins. All this took place to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they will call his name Emmanuel, which means God with us. So within the context of the book of Matthew, this is a sign to Joseph. And the point of the sign is that he should not hesitate to take Mary as his wife. And the birth of the child that she bears will be the fulfillment of Isaiah's prophecy. So, how do we understand this? Well, there are a couple of things that we have to clarify. First, the child that's going to be born to the young woman, the Alma in Hebrew, is a sign, as we said, to Ahaz, to be fulfilled shortly after the prophecy was given. That's the only possible way that the text of Isaiah can be understood. This young woman, or Alma in Hebrew, foreshadows a greater fulfillment in the person of the miraculous birth to a virgin, Greek parthenos, at a more distant time to come. This child who is to be born in the time to come will be Emmanuel, but will be Emmanuel in a much greater sense than the child who was born at the time of Ahaz was Emmanuel. At the time of Ahaz, the child simply represented symbolically the presence of God with his people, protecting them from the invaders. At the time of Matthew, the child born wouldn't just symbolically represent God. He would be God with us. So he would be Emmanuel in a much greater sense. He will not simply be a sign that God is with us. He'll actually be God with us. So, it is possible, but not necessary, that Isaiah himself fully understood that this was going to be fulfilled not just in the time of Ahaz, but in some distant future time to come in the person of Jesus. It's possible that Isaiah understood that. It's possible that he didn't understand it. The text doesn't tell us that. Nevertheless, we affirm that this is an actual predictive prophecy of the birth of Jesus. But it's also the actual predictive prophecy of someone who would be born at the time of Ahaz, who, before he reached the ages of, say, 8 to 12, they would see the kings of Samaria and Damascus defeated by the Assyrians. So what can we conclude from this exercise? First, we have recognized that it is an misapplication of the principle of one literal sense to apply it to the interpretation of prophecy. That was not the purpose for which the principle was articulated, and applying it to prophecy creates a false antithesis and puts us in a situation where we must either declare the prophet to be a false prophet or recognize that the New Testament author was inventing a connection between the Old Testament text and the person and work of Jesus. The solution that we identified was to recognize that there's a third type of prophetic material in the Bible. Not only does the Bible contain typology and rectilinear prophecy, it also contains what I called typolinear prophecy, which has elements of each. And one of the most important elements of typolinear prophecy, our third conclusion, is that it is the literal sense of typolinear prophecy that it is fulfilled in stages over time. And recognizing this, then, helps us to conform our understanding of prophecy to the actual practice of the biblical authors. And it also eliminates the false alternative offered by historical criticism on one hand, and those like Hengstenberg on the other, who maintain that to believe in rectilinear prophecy, you must conclude that the prophecy had no meaning whatsoever to its original primary audience. I'm Dr. David Adams. I thank you for joining me for this look at the challenges of interpreting Messianic prophecy, and I look forward to being with you again in another session in the future.